Just a little interplay with the choir there. So the game warden gets called, and he hears that there are a couple of good old redneck fellas down at the lake dynamiting fish. Now, if you don't know what that is, that's where you take dynamite with a waterproof fuse, you light it, you throw it in the water, it goes off, stuns the fish, and you can gather them up when they float to the top by the dozen, or so I am told. The fact I have an empty dynamite box in my study at home means nothing at all. Right? So the game warden pulls up in his boat next to the two good old boys, and he says, fellas, I hear you've been dynamiting fish. One of the old boys looks at the game warden and says, what's that to you? And he says, well, that's illegal in Oklahoma. You cannot do that. The old fellow says, really? Well, what are you going to do about it, Mr. Warden? He said, well, if you keep doing that, I'm going to have to arrest you and throw you in jail. The old fellow takes a stick of dynamite, lights it with a cigarette lighter, throws it in the back of the game warden's boat, looks at him and says, you going to talk or you going to fish? That's what the Bible is saying today. Are you going to talk? Are you going to fish? Are you going to do something that matters? Or are you just going to keep talking about doing something that matters with your life? Brandon and I, Pastor Brandon and I take turns kind of writing and getting a general outline for the sermon series. And when he put the title up for this week, Jonah's Obedience, I said, oh man, I don't know about that. You know, I mean, man, in the middle of the summer, middle of July, you're talking about obedience. I don't think people are going to be real, happy with that. He was exactly right. The word obedience in Scripture is not just about obeying orders. It's about living your life in a certain way. A way that recognizes that God is the sovereign of all creation. And that we're called to live out God's calling in our life. It's our vocation. As I shared with you last week, you might be a plumber, a painter, a doctor, a nurse, a teacher, a principal, a fireman, a policeman in the army. That's what you do. But your vocation, your calling, is to be a minister of Jesus Christ in the world. That's what we're going to talk about today. We begin with a guy that Jesus talked about himself, a guy named Jonah, right? And Jonah's name means soaring dove, or dove that soars, to get it literally right in the Hebrew, dove that soars. Which reminds me, I have a really close friend that's a full-blood Cherokee, and I asked him one time if I could have an Indian name, if he would give me an Indian name. And he said, sure, man who walks to buffet. And that wasn't really what I was thinking about. You know? Sometimes names are a little too descriptive, right? Right? In Jonah's case, I don't think the name is descriptive at all. Dove who soars. He does anything but soar. In fact, what he does, he doesn't go up, he goes down, right? Because God says, Jonah, go to Nineveh. Alan Shell, you've been there, haven't you? You've been there. Go to Nineveh. Let me put it in terms of modern geography that we'd understand. God says to Jonah, a Jew, go to Syria and find the worst terrorists there, and you tell them, as a Jewish guy, you tell them if they don't get their act together, God is going to whoop up on them. And Jonah goes to beautiful Joppa, which is on the Mediterranean coast in Israel, sees the beaches there and thinks, well, I could go to Nineveh. I could go to Syria, but instead I'm going to go to Tarshish. Instead I'm going to go to a beautiful Italian beach and eat pizza and lay back in the sand. And he gets on the boat and he heads for that beautiful Italian beach, and a terrible storm comes up. You remember, we've been studying this. And finally he ends up in the sea and he is swallowed by a great fish, right? And he's in the fish for 3 days and 3 nights before the fish pukes him up like a bit of bad chowder on the beach. And that's where we are today. Jonah's just come up reeking of 3-day-old pizza. He's covered with the nastiness, and the story restarts. You heard Blake read it just a moment ago. The words are almost exactly like the first verse in the first chapter, even though we're in the 3rd verse. God sends Jonah to Nineveh. Now, we remember from last week that Jonah had been in the belly of that fish, and he had been praying to get out of that. And God hears our prayers. We've sung about that and prayed about that this morning. God hears our prayers, but I just got to tell you that whenever you pray for God to get you out of a mission, this is pretty much what happens. All God does is reinstall you in that ministry again. If you feel like you're being called to visit someone in the hospital or to talk to someone about faith and you don't want to do it and you pray, God, get me out of this, you're going to find that the situation is going to take you back time and again to that very thing you're running away from. I can testify to that. It happens to me every week, sometimes several times a day. I end up puked up on the beach with God telling me to go on to Nineveh. Now, the first Christians looked at this. You may not know this. You see the little Christian symbol of a fish. And lots of times, because we are who we are, we think that symbol comes from Jesus feeding the 5,000 with fishes and loaves. Because after all, my religion is all about me, right? My religion is all about what kind of goodies I get. That's how a lot of us look at religion. But if you'll pay careful attention to that ancient Christian symbol, you'll notice it's a fish, not a fish and a piece of French bread. Right? Because for the early Christians, they adopted that symbol from this story. Jonah went down into the depths. He was as good as dead. When God scooped him up in the belly of the fish, brought him up through the waters, laid him on the beach at the first step of his mission, and gave him a second life. The images of baptism, dying to your first life, being lifted up through the water to your new life in Jesus Christ. If you remember, Jesus was baptized in the Gospel of Mark and then driven to his ministry. That's the image the first Christians saw. When they used that fish as a symbol, it wasn't about what they were going to get. It's about who they were called to be. A people offering Christ to the world. So here's our friend Jonah, or as my Cherokee friend might say, dove who doesn't soar. And he's got to go to Nineveh. And he makes the hike. I don't think he took a shower or anything because he didn't like the Ninevites. He goes in puke covered. And he starts to walk across that great city. The Bible said it was such a great city, it took 3 days to walk across. That is a gigantic city by biblical terms. In those days, you could usually walk across a city you read about in the Bible, in about 30 minutes, maybe an hour. 3 days of constant walk. It's a giant city filled with tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people, as big as any city in the world, maybe the biggest city in the world of its time. And all the way across, he preaches this really weak, miserable sermon. It's only 5 words in Hebrew. I can sum it up for you. I'll take it from Hebrew to English to Okie real quick, and I don't even need 5 words. In Okie, the sermon is simply turn or burn. Turn or burn. That's it. That's it. It's that simple. Because he doesn't really care about the people he's preaching to. He's just trying to fulfill and be what he thinks of as obedient. But remember, obedience is not what you do, it's who you are. But he doesn't get that yet. It's going to take another chapter or so for him to get that. So he preaches this pitiful sermon, and this amazing thing happens. The people of Nineveh start to cover themselves with sackcloth and ashes like we do on Ash Wednesday, which in the ancient world is a symbol of extreme grief. It's like the person most important to you in your entire life has died. That's what you do. These Assyrians who had in their nurseries the skins of Israeli soldiers plastered up on the wall so that as their babies were growing up, they knew what you were supposed to do if you were an Assyrian. You're supposed to go do that to Israelis, to the Hebrew people. Now hearing a Hebrew prophet preach, break down in a kind of deep existential grief that moves from the common folk all the way to the palace. Now, when you read the story in the Bible, if you read it in the King James, the RSV, the NIV, you're gonna hear language there, and you're gonna think, man, that sounds so familiar, but I just don't remember exactly where it comes from. When you hear Jonah's sermon, you're gonna say, that sounds so familiar, but I just can't quite place it. Let me tell you where it comes from. What Jonah preaches, well, they're the same words that were spoken once to Sodom and Gomorrah. Same sermon. Sodom and Gomorrah reacted differently and were lost. This time the people break down in grief. Even the animals in the story grieve. They're covered in ashes and sackcloth. Because all of creation has been torn away from God by the burden of our evil and sin, by our violence that we do against each other. Oh, I know in our culture, we do it very politely. We ignore one another. We unfriend people on social media. We do those things so politely, but it is violent nonetheless. All of creation is broken and crying out for healing. And if you don't understand the part about the animals, let me just remind you that Jesus is going to say to every one of you, every one of us who claims to be a follower of Christ, that we have a ministry to all of creation, including every single animal. It's really amazing when you think about it. You go to the Gospel of Mark. Jesus has been crucified, resurrected. He's ready to go back to heaven. He's commissioning his disciples. And in the 16th chapter of Mark, in the 15th chapter, he says, "Go into all the world and proclaim the good news to every creature." See, the work that God is asking you to do, to pour your life, your heart, your passion, your resources, your energy into, is of cosmic value. Faith in Christ and serving God is not just about making yourself feel good or being more comfortable or thinking that you're an okay person. It's about doing the work of the sovereign God who breathed life into every single creature. It's about doing God's work in the world, in a world that aches and hurts because of violence and war, because of this incredible ability we seem to have as human beings to turn our backs on those who need help. To enter into that world and do the work of God has cosmic significance. When we die and go to heaven, and all of us will because you go to Centenary, so that's guaranteed. I'm going to say it till somebody proves me wrong. I'm going to say it till then. Right? When we stand before Christ, we're not going to be held accountable for the number of degrees we had or how many square feet our home was or how much money we had in stocks and bonds. We're going to be held accountable for how many people we share the good news with. What is that good news that Jesus will say we need to speak to every creature, every part of creation? When you get up in the morning and you're singing to your backyard, just the plants and the rocks, the grass. You're doing the work of God. What is that good news? Think about it in this story. There's story after story like this in the Old Testament where God looks at a group of people who are so sinful, so awesome, awful, so terrible, they should just be wiped off the face of the earth. Because there's a part of God that is about justice. It's about justice. And that part demands that things be made right. But then there's another part of God that's even stronger than that, bigger, more of a priority. And that is that God is a God of mercy. You see, we all stand under the same condemnation, the same guilt as Nineveh. We're no different than any of them. We have those things in our life we do that we know are wrong, the times we turn our back on those who need. And yet, just like Nineveh, God pours his mercy out on us. Even the animals weep at the power of God's mercy. And God takes that power and puts it into your hands. The power to share with the people around you, the world around you, that our God is a loving and merciful God. Two ways I think we're called to change the world. The first is to cross the lines that seem uncrossable. We know what they are, don't we? Lines of race, lines of sexual orientation, lines of economic status, gender lines, age lines. We know what they are. Those lines you're never supposed to cross. We all have our Nineveh. One of my favorite stories is about a young pastor named Fred Rogers. When he was in seminary in Pittsburgh, the Presbyterian seminary there, which is a very good seminary, he was in the middle of preaching class when this professor pulled him over and said, Fred, I understand you're really good in children's ministry. In fact, I understand you're a great puppeteer. And Fred said, yes, that's right. And he said, the professor said, I've heard you preach. I'd focus on the puppets. So Fred Rogers went down to the local PBS station in Pittsburgh, and he offered them a little children's show with puppets called Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. Wasn't the original name, but that's the name you know it by. And that show took off, and it got bigger than Pittsburgh. It got bigger than the United States. It ended up all over the world. This wonderful show where this guy, Mr. Rogers, would come home in the evening. He would take off his suit coat. He would put on his little zippered cardigan sweater. And he would take off his dress shoes, and he would put on his little blue sneakers, right? And he would interact with the puppets and the other characters in the neighborhood. It was just so sweet and so powerful and driven by the heart of this wonderful Presbyterian pastor who loved people, especially children. In 1969, the show was in full production. It was at the height of its popularity. America was being torn apart by race issues. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. Shows in those days, particularly children's shows, were never political. But Fred Rogers knew he had to do something. He was in a worship service, and a guy got up to do a solo who was black. Fred, of course, was white. The guy's name was Francois Clemens, and he went on to win Grammys as a singer. He's a great singer. And afterwards, Fred went up to Francois and he said, Sir, Mr. Clemens, I've got this children's show on TV. I'd like you to come be a character. I'd like you to come be a police officer in the show. There's a lot going on in our culture right now, particularly between black people and white people, and between police officers and black people. I'd like you to come portray a black police officer on my show. Now remember, this is literally the week after Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. Francois Clemens looked at this skinny little soft-spoken Presbyterian preacher and said, are you crazy? I grew up in inner city Detroit. My people, my family are the people the police are chasing down with dogs. I would never play a policeman. And I would never be a part of your all-white thing. I don't know why you would approach me. They're standing in church having this conversation. And Francois Clemens said, a lot of people think that Fred Rogers was really soft, because he was so gentle-spoken. He said, but once he decided something, you could not change his mind. And before he knew it, Francois Clemens was in the studio putting on a policeman's uniform. And he became Officer Clemens, the first black character on a children's television show in American history. Now, a few months later, there was a photograph that went out across every newspaper in America. There was still this awful racial battle was going on. And there was a picture of a swimming pool, and it had a sign up that said whites only. And there were little black children swimming in the swimming pool. And there was a picture of a white man, a very angry white man, and he had a jug filled with acid. And he was trying to pour it on the little black children because they had dared go swimming in a white swimming pool. And once again, Fred knew that he had to do something. And that next morning, when people turned on their televisions to watch Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood that afternoon, whenever you saw it in your town, there was this scene where Mr. Rogers comes home and takes off his shoes, doesn't put on his slippers, goes to a little swimming pool he has there, and starts to soak his feet in the water. And then Officer Clemens shows up at his door. And Fred Rogers invited Officer Clemens, a black man, to take off his shoes and socks and soak with him in the swimming pool together. And that moment, America changed. Hundreds of thousands of children would never see the country the way their parents and grandparents did ever again. They saw a black man and a white man who were friends. They could share a pool together. The second thing I would want you to know is that we all have a Nineveh, and it begins at home. We all have a place we're called to serve, and it begins right with the people around us. We're called to make our witness, our testimony, to share our faith, the good news of God's mercy with those people. What Jesus called the sign of Jonah, that emblem of being laid in a tomb and raised up. You and I are called to share that. I have a friend who we've been very close friends for many, many years. He's a guitar player. Pretty soon we'll be celebrating a 30-year anniversary of a contemporary worship service he and I started in Oklahoma City many, many years ago, obviously. And we've just been friends all these years. When I was his pastor those many years ago, he was just an awesome guy in the church. He was that guy that could always lead a Bible study. He was always ready to do it, always ready to be a youth sponsor, take the children to Six Flags, whatever it took to get the job done at work. And what was more amazing than anything about that is that he was raising by himself 5 children because he had a wife who was dying. This guy, John, if anybody ever had a reason to be let off the hook in his faith life, it was John. He was doing all he could to keep it together with his family. But one day, John was there in my office, and he brought a man named Bud with him, and I knew Bud. Bud was the town drunk. Bud was the opposite of John. He had scattered children all over town that he didn't want anything to do with them. They didn't want anything to do with him. He was 40 years old, living at home with his mother because he couldn't keep a job. He showed up at church about 6 times a year with his mom when she put enough guilt on him to make him come, always reeking of alcohol. And that day, John and Bud were sitting in my office, and Bud looked at me and said, "Pastor, John came to me." Hear that? John came to me and offered me a job. And nobody in this town will give me a job, but John offered me a job. John told me there are 3 conditions for that job. I have to go to AA with him 3 times a week. I have to come to church every Sunday. And I'm supposed to come meet with you, my pastor, every week and talk about how I'm doing in my faith life. And Bud looked at me and he said, "Pastor, I know if I don't do those 3 things, I'm going to die." Now, I've been a pastor a long time. I've heard a lot of those stories. But back then, I was just a young guy out of seminary. And even then, I went, no way. No way can this guy do this. Sometimes in life, all it takes is someone who's there to pick you up when you've been vomited out of the belly of the fish and be a friend for you. This month, Bud is celebrating 32 years of sobriety. . For the last 20 years, he's been a Sunday school teacher. John's Sunday school teacher. The power of God is amazing. The power of God can change and transform any situation. And the amazing thing is the power of God flows through you. Isn't it time you started that walk to your Nineveh? This is the word of God in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Amen.